On the cold evening of the 28th of November 1943, Tehran did not look like the stage for history's biggest decision-makers. It looked like a city holding its breath. Dust hung in the air like a thin veil. Headlights cut across narrow streets, then vanished into darkness. Behind tall walls and guarded gates, three men, Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, were about to sit in the same compound and redraw the map of a world still on fire. Yet the most dangerous weapon in Tehran that week was not a tank or a bomber. It was a rumor with a trigger. What if the big three could be killed in a single night before they could agree on how to end the war? That question became the heartbeat of one of World War II's most infamous intelligence stories. Operation Long Jump, the alleged German plan to assassinate all three leaders at the Tehran Conference. The plan has been repeated for decades as a daring plot foiled by Soviet counterintelligence. It has also been dismissed by many historians as exaggerated, poorly sourced, or possibly shaped by wartime propaganda. But whether it was a real operation, an inflated scare, or a carefully planted narrative, it reveals something uncomfortably true about war. The fight is not only on battlefields. Sometimes it is fought inside locked rooms, between radio clicks, coded phrases, and men who never wear uniforms. By late 1943, the strategic picture was turning. The Soviet Union had stopped the Wehrmacht's momentum and was pushing west. Britain and the United States were building the industrial and logistical mass for an invasion of Western Europe. Tehran mattered because it forced alignment. The opening of a second front in France, the timing of major offensives, and the political choreography of what the post-war order might look like. For Germany, this was more than a meeting. It was a convergence of enemies. If Hitler's Germany could somehow decapitate Allied leadership, remove Stalin's pressure from the East, and throw London and Washington into chaos, could the war's trajectory be altered? Even a temporary vacuum at the top might cause delays, paralysis, or infighting. And in late 1943, time was becoming the one resource Germany was running out of. This is the core logic that makes the long jump story so seductive. It sounds like a commando fantasy, but it is rooted in a rational fear that a single event could break the Allied coalition's rhythm. Churchill and Roosevelt had already survived assassination scares. Stalin lived in a universe where betrayal was not an exception but a default assumption. Put all three in one city far from their home security ecosystems, and the risk feels obvious. The question becomes, was the risk merely theoretical, or did Germany truly commit resources to make it real? Tehran was chosen largely for logistical and security reasons. Stalin was reluctant to travel far from Soviet territory, and Iran was accessible by air corridors and supply routes. But Tehran was also a complicated environment. Iran had been occupied by Allied forces earlier in the war to secure supply lines and limit Axis influence. It was a crossroads of embassies, intelligence services, informants, and black market networks. In a city like that, secrets were currency. For an assassination plot, this is what makes Tehran ideal. Lots of noise to hide in, lots of competing agencies, and plenty of reasons for strangers to be present. It is also what makes Tehran impossible. If multiple Allied services were already saturated in the city, any unusual movement could light up like a flare. Security for the conference reflected this tension. Multiple rings of guards, controlled routes, and tight access lists were standard. The Soviet security apparatus, especially the NKVD, treated the event as if it were a battlefield. The British were experienced in protective security, but they also knew they were operating in a foreign environment with layers of local and Allied control. The Americans brought their own protocols, but Roosevelt's mobility limitations added complexity. And when security planners decided that Roosevelt should stay inside the Soviet compound, near Stalin, it reduced exposure to the streets, but increased the consequences of any breach. When you concentrate leadership, you also concentrate catastrophe. So the security question sharpened. If a plot existed, it would have to pierce a layered defense system. That generally requires either extraordinary luck or an inside edge, local assets, reliable communications, and the ability to move quietly in a city under surveillance. Operation Long Jump is often linked, sometimes too neatly, to SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny. By 1943, Skorzeny was already famous within German circles for bold special operations, especially the rescue of Benito Mussolini. His reputation made him a convenient symbol of the man who could do the impossible. And in storytelling, attaching a plot to a charismatic operator turns it from a technical plan into a cinematic narrative. But that is also the problem. High-profile operatives attract myth. In the Long Jump story, Skorzeny is said to have been selected to command the assassination phase after an advance team established the groundwork. Yet, outside of Soviet-aligned accounts and later retellings, documentation is thin. Skorzeny himself later denied involvement. Many researchers have noted the lack of solid German archival evidence for such a mission in Tehran. That does not automatically prove the story. False special operations leave fewer footprints by design, but it forces a more careful question. Are we looking at an operational plan or at a psychological operation? Because if you can convince your enemy that you almost killed their leaders, you have already achieved something. You have created fear. You have justified tighter control. You have elevated your own intelligence service's prestige, and you have shaped the historical memory of who protected the world at a crucial moment. According to the most widely repeated Soviet narrative, the Germans planned to insert agents into Iran, establish communications, and coordinate an attack on the leaders during the conference. The key claim is that Soviet intelligence, aided by a local network, uncovered the plot early, before the final operational phase could be executed. This is where Gevork Vartanian enters the story. Vartanian was a Soviet intelligence operative working in Iran, often described as leading a network that tracked Axis agents and relayed information back to Soviet handlers. In popular accounts, his group identifies German operatives, sometimes described as radio operators or reconnaissance personnel, moving in Tehran. Surveillance tightens. Signals are detected. Safe houses are mapped. Arrests follow. The plot, in this telling, collapses not during a dramatic shootout, but through the slow, methodical suffocation of counterintelligence. Watch, identify, isolate, capture. If this is accurate even in broad outline, it highlights the most underappreciated truth in intelligence work. Most victories are not explosions. They are paperwork, patience, and the disciplined refusal to act too soon. But even here, the story raises questions. How large was the German footprint in Tehran at that moment? How reliable were Soviet sources? What was the plan? In concrete terms, sniper, fire, bombs, infiltration, disguised as Allied personnel, an assault on a convoy. Details vary widely, depending on the retelling. And when details vary widely, professionals become suspicious. Real operations can be murky, but a coherent operation usually has a coherent signature. To assess plausibility, it helps to break the alleged mission into operational necessities without romance. Insertion and cover. Agents would need legitimate reasons to exist in Tehran, or access to forged documents and safe routes. In an occupied and heavily monitored city, movement is possible but dangerous. Reliable communications. A clandestine mission lives or dies by comms. Radio traffic is also one of the easiest fingerprints to detect, especially for a service like the NKVD that was trained to hunt it. Targeting and timing. The leader's routes, schedules, and meeting locations would need to be predictable. Protective security exists precisely to make this unpredictable. Weapons and escape. Assassination is only half the mission. Exfiltration matters too, especially if the intent is to destabilize the enemy with proof of success. Tehran's geography and Allied control would make escape difficult. Now, ask the hardest question. Would Germany risk a small commando team in Tehran for a low-probability, high-impact strike? Germany did execute bold special operations. But by late 1943, resources were stretched, and strategic outcomes were increasingly determined by industrial scale. A decapitation strike could, in theory, buy time. Yet buying time is not the same as winning the war. So, if an operation was proposed, It might have been discussed at planning levels without being fully resourced, or it might have been probed and abandoned once the difficulty became clear. That kind of planned but not executed scenario would still produce whispers that later grow into legend. Even if the core of the plot was smaller than later narratives suggest, the Soviet incentive to amplify it is straightforward: legitimacy and prestige. Demonstrating that Soviet intelligence protected not only Stalin but also Churchill and Roosevelt elevates the NKVD's status as an indispensable ally. Control of the narrative. If Roosevelt stayed in the Soviet compound, it could be framed as a Soviet security achievement rather than an American or British decision. Domestic messaging. A story of heroic counterintelligence plays well internally, reinforcing the idea that the Soviet state is vigilant, competent, and central to victory. Diplomatic leverage. Subtly reminding allies that Soviet security saved them can create psychological debt, even if nobody says it out loud. And the most important point: propaganda and truth are not mutually exclusive. Intelligence victories can be real and still be dramatized, expanded, or simplified for strategic effect. There is another angle that makes the long jump story strategically interesting, even if no commando ever set foot near the leaders. In intelligence, the mere existence of a credible threat can shape behavior. If Soviet services could persuade Allied security teams that Tehran was saturated with German assets, then Allied leaders would accept tighter Soviet control, fewer movements, and more reliance on Soviet protection. That reduces risk, yes, but it also increases Soviet visibility and influence. It is not cynical to say this. It is professional to recognize that security arrangements are also political arrangements. So consider the possibility that the plot functioned as an information operation either initiated by German rumor, intercepted and amplified by Soviets, or even partly manufactured to justify specific security decisions. In that scenario, the operational goal is not assassination, it is behavioral control. And that raises a chilling rhetorical question. If you can move presidents and prime ministers like pieces on a board by whispering the right threat, do you need a gunman at all? The Tehran Conference was not only about military plans, it was about personalities. Stalin demanded proof that the West would bleed in Europe, not only supply the Soviet Union from afar. Churchill worried about post-war balance and Soviet expansion. Roosevelt focused on alliance cohesion and the path to an enduring peace architecture. These were not identical goals. They were overlapping interests held together by necessity. An assassination threat attacks that fragile glue. If Stalin is killed, the Soviet system might harden under a different figure, perhaps less cooperative or more brutal. If Roosevelt is killed, American politics could lurch unpredictably, and wartime strategy might face internal shocks. If Churchill is killed, Britain's war leadership would be destabilized at a critical juncture. Even if the coalition survives, the tempo changes. This is why the long jump story, real or not, still matters. It dramatizes the coalition's vulnerability not in tanks and planes, but in the fact that the war's direction was heavily concentrated in a handful of individuals. Here is what can be said with confidence at a structural level. Tehran was an intelligence battleground. Multiple services operated there. German intelligence had reason to cultivate assets in Iran earlier in the war. Allied security took extraordinary precautions, and Soviet counterintelligence was aggressive, experienced, and politically motivated to be seen as the controlling force. In such a climate, it is highly plausible that Soviet operatives monitored German-linked networks, detected communications, and conducted arrests. It is also plausible that Allied security decisions, such as consolidating leaders within the Soviet compound, were influenced by perceived threats. The jump from "there were German agents" to "there" was a coordinated Skorzeny-led assassination plan against all three leaders is the part that remains contested. But history is not only a list of confirmed events. It is also the record of how people behaved under uncertainty. And in Tehran, uncertainty itself was a weapon. If the Soviet account is taken at face value, the climax is not a dramatic shootout. It is the moment an intelligence officer realizes the pattern is real. The moment a radio signal is not random noise but a message. The moment a familiar face in a market is not a merchant but a courier. The moment a safe house is not a home but a node in a network. Counterintelligence climaxes are quiet. A knock on a door at the wrong hour. A sudden checkpoint that should not exist. A man who does not return from a routine walk. A code that stops transmitting. The absence of violence becomes the proof of success. Nothing happens. The leaders speak, argue, bargain, and decide. The conference ends. The war continues on its brutal path without that one catastrophic interruption. And yet, the absence of the event is precisely what keeps the story alive. When a disaster is prevented, the public sees no crater, no rubble, no blood. All they have is a claim that it almost happened. That is fertile ground for myth. Whether Operation Long Jump was a concrete German plan, a partially formed concept, or a magnified intelligence narrative, it offers enduring lessons. Security is strategy. Protecting leaders is not a procedural detail. It shapes what decisions can be made and how freely leaders can act. Intelligence warfare thrives on ambiguity. The most effective operations often leave just enough evidence to be believable and just enough uncertainty to be deniable. Narratives can be operational assets. The story of a foiled assassination can strengthen alliances, justify control, and project competence even if the underlying facts are less dramatic. Coalitions are vulnerable at the top. When strategy concentrates in a few individuals, the temptation for decapitation strikes and the paranoia around them rises. The truth of wartime stories is often layered. A real threat can be exaggerated. An exaggerated threat can still produce real behavioral effects. Tehran's streets returned to their ordinary rhythms after the conference. But for those few days in late 1943, the city was a pressure chamber. Inside guarded walls, the Big Three argued over fronts and timelines, over promises and distrust, over the shape of victory. Outside those walls, intelligence services hunted shadows, some real, some imagined, all dangerous. So what is Operation Long Jump in the end? A failed German masterpiece or a Soviet legend polished into permanence? The most honest answer may be that it is both a warning and a mirror. A warning about how close history can come to catastrophic discontinuity, and a mirror reflecting the nature of modern war where killing an enemy is not always the goal. Sometimes controlling the story is. Because in Tehran, the decisive force may not have been a gun that fired or a bomb that exploded. It may have been the quiet certainty inside a security chief's mind. Nothing will happen tonight. And if nothing happened, history could proceed imperfectly, brutally, but intact.